Hi, everybody. It's great to see friendly and familiar faces in the room. Hi, Rabbi. Um, really, thank you for the opportunity to speak to you at what I think actually is probably the most important inflection point we've been in, certainly in my lifetime. I think in most of our lifetimes when I look around the room, following what is the hardest year that our people has experienced in decades. I'll share with you anecdotally, my first emergency trip was actually to New York City, right here. It was not even a week and a half after 10/7. And I had left the Shiva of our very best friend's son, of Arya Ziering. And Mark, his father, just completed the 11 months of saying Kaddish for Arya. So it's unbelievable to think of the passage of time. It's just a different passage of time. It feels on one hand like 10 years and on the other hand like a day. And we meet not only in the post 10/7 world, and although some of you who've heard me speak, that I refer to it intentionally as 10/7, because 10/7, like 9/11, was the attack of barbarism on our civilization. But that is not how it went down in the books. The responses to 10/7, unlike 9/11, was minimized, if at all, to what is one single day of the attack of Jews and cast as what is sometimes related to as the Israel-Gaza war. That is not what happened on 10/7. And I want to remind us just for a moment, because we received a reminder of the minimization of 10/7 just 2 days ago, when 6 Israeli hostages were executed point blank to the back of the head, among them an American Israeli citizen. And as opposed to the executions that we witnessed by ISIS, the response not only had the lag time of maybe a day of some sympathy, but in fact saw immediate demonstrations right here in New York City that echoed once again the Hamas charter, from the river to the sea and resistance by any means, and flew Hamas flags right here in New York City, only to be followed by the next day of first day of fall semester with the very same responses to what has been the worst day perhaps since 10/7. But I want to recap of what 10/7 was. On 10/7, on Simchat Torah, Shabbat, we were all celebrating, as we have for thousands of years, the book that kept us as a people for thousands of years. The desecration of that day is so much deeper than I think in this shell-shocked year that we've experienced, we've given thought to. 50 years after the Yom Kippur War, the desecration of what Simchat Torah symbolizes for us as a people, of what kept us as a people for millennia when we were stateless, when we were exiled from our ancestral homeland, the desecration of the day that Simchat Torah represents, and of course, the erasure of the Simcha from the perspective Simchat Torah. And I'll share with you anecdotally, we're having a Achnasat Sefer Torah for Arya Ziering's memory in our shul. And our rabbi, Seth Barber, said to Debbie, who he grew up with, what are we going to do with Achnasat Sefer Torah? You know, on Simchat Torah, we're going to dance? And she said to him, Rabbi, for thousands of years, our people have danced with the Torah. Of course, we're going to dance. So picturing what, sorry, my apologies. Picturing what this Simchat Torah will look like is really in your hands in many ways. And the understanding that it is not just 10/7 and the war crimes and crimes against humanity perpetrated against our people on 10/7, of 1,200 people murdered and butchered and raped and burned and maimed and mutilated, and 251 abducted. I always say, in the language of international law, that's a standing violation of international law, because every second of every minute of every hour of every day of 334 days is another war crime every single second. That's why it's called a standing violation of international law of the remaining 101 hostages still held by Hamas in Gaza. But in fact, and this is really important to mention because it doesn't feel like it here. And the hardest thing that I remember feeling on that first emergency trip, I feel now, it is the dissonance and the gap of what I'm trying to relay, which is a feeling. It's the existential understanding that this morning sirens sounded in Kiryat Shmona with yet another barrage of rockets that are sounding war. How am I? I hear sirens in that first trip when I heard a siren, I jumped. I don't jump now. The understanding that there is this existential moment that has continued in a multi-front war from the north, Hezbollah, that has still displaced about 60,000 Israelis from their homes with all of the trauma that that brings. September 1st was the first day of school in Israel. They're not in their schools. They're not in their homes. From the south, of course, we understand that the Houthis actually yesterday, apparently, I don't know if you've already heard, but apparently there were about 4 interceptions of rockets still fired by the Houthis at Israel, and understanding that Hamas continues in its standing violation of international law and human rights in this Orwellian inverted time where in a crazy development of reality, after 6 hostages are executed, the pressure is immediately placed on Israel for concessions rather than the pressure being for consequences, not just on Hamas, but on the countries that enable Hamas, be it Qatar, be it Turkey, be it Egypt. And so when we meet at this inflection point of understanding that the war continues raging, I think that the first order of business is to make that accessible. It's not just 10/7. The war has not stopped since 10/7. And when we look at the implications for Israelis, the entire Israeli public is implicated. Whether it's the 703, I believe, soldiers we have buried since 10/7, Aryeh being one of them, or the many murdered, traumatized, experiencing that Nova festival, not just in what they witnessed, but in what they now carry with them for the rest of their lives, or the tsunami of anti-Semitism that our students, that our corporations, or people working in our corporations face right here, the very same anti-Semitism. And I've said this from day one, that fueled the atrocities, the war crimes, the crimes against humanity of 10/7, is the anti-Semitism that fuels the responses to the atrocities, to the war crimes, to the crimes against humanity of 10/7 and since 10/7, the responses of silence. Me Too, unless you're a Jew, international women's organizations, the responses of denial. That did not happen. The responses of justification. Judith Butler, who I studied in law school, rape as armed resistance. The responses of support. We are Hamas. From the river to the sea, echoing the Hamas charter, a designated terror organization right here just 2 days ago on the streets of New York City, as I said. And finally, the responses of attacking Jews wherever they may be, on campus, on streets, online. And if I had to say one thing other than the importance of making accessible that it is the very same anti-Semitism that we face as a people, and the utilization, of course, of the single definition that we have, comprehensive definition that we have for anti-Semitism that includes this strain of anti-Semitism, the anti-Zionism that negates Israel's very right to exist, and that is the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition. And I cannot score more in more words the importance of making accessible the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism in order to be able to understand that we face this together as a people, whether in Israel on 10/7, since 10/7, or right here on Columbia's campus, the very same anti-Semitism. If I have to look at a group of rabbis and think, what is it that at this moment in time our people need more than anything? It is not just the understanding of hope. And those of you that have heard me speak know that I always quote the late Rabbi Sachs and what hope means as opposed to optimism, which is a very passive virtue that requires no courage at all, as opposed to hope, That is a very active virtue that requires a great deal of courage. Our national anthem being Hatikva, it's not just the hope. It is the understanding that you carry with you the possibility of actually responding to what I always speak about with regards to including the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism, the mechanism that has enabled the mutation of anti-Semitism, the 3Ds, if you will, Natan Sharansky's 3Ds, the demonization and the delegitimization and the double standards. That is the mechanism that has enabled the ever mutating virus of anti-Semitism to produce new strains over and over and over again. And matters not if those 3Ds demonize, delegitimize, or apply double standards to the individual Jew, barring him or her from an equal place in society, on campus, in their spaces, or if they demonize, delegitimize, and apply double standards to the nation state of the Jewish people, intended to be the Jew of the states, but turned into, intended to be the state of the Jews, but turned into systematically the Jew among the states. What is most important for me at this existential moment is that the response to those 3Ds are what I sort of call the 3 Rs. And I think that that's where you are instrumental and so important. It is to remember. It's to remember our story. You know, when I speak to students sometimes and say to them, I have good news or bad news, depending on how you view this issue, but you're not white. You're not white. It's not relevant to your story if you're a Jewish student. And if you're friends with a Jew, you should know it's not a relevant social construct to the story of our people. We're a prototypical indigenous people. That's what we are. Why prototypical indigenous? Because indigeneity has meaning, that speak the same language Hebrew, that read the same book that was desecrated on Simchat Torah, the Tanakh, that traverse the same land, Israel, that practice the same customs and rituals for thousands of years. So whatever it is that's happening in your life right now that accuses you of being something that you are not, you need to remember your story. And you are the people that make accessible that story, of course, bringing it to life and bringing it to light. And I think there's no more important time to do so. The second R that I speak about is to reclaim. So after we've remembered our story, we need to reclaim our identity. And you have it in your title. Zionist is integral to the identity of the majority of Jews and many non-Jews who believe in Israel's right to exist. I cannot just shed my Zionist pound of flesh. It is integral to my identity because for thousands of years, my ancestors prayed and yearned and longed to return to Zion. It's non-negotiable. Now, there may be Jews, including in your congregations, who self-define as anti-Zionist, and that is their right. What is not their right is to preclude me from self-identifying as a Zionist. That is not their right. And in many ways, including when I meet with university presidents right here, the understanding, again, that the IRA working definition enables a university to afford the same protection and safe space and whatever else they're affording their students to a Jew who self-identifies as an anti-Zionist and to a Jew who self-defines as a Zionist, because I cannot just shed my Zionist pound of flesh. And by the way, to a non-Jew who self-identifies as a Zionist, that is the place from which we begin to reclaim our identity. I think that reclaiming that and reclaiming indigeneity as part of remembering the story is going to be critical as we move forward and equip this generation that is really up against what I believe our generation did not experience. You know, I look at Rabbi Steinmetz, and growing up in Montreal, he was a rabbi for many years. I realized recently that what we lived in our generation was an anomaly. We thought it was the new normal. But when you look at the thousands of years of Jewish history, this is the normal. We thought we lived a new normal, but in fact, we lived an anomaly. And in that sense, it's for that reason that perhaps we failed to equip our kids, our congregants, this generation with the tools that they need in order to be able to survive, to thrive in what is the normal of our thousands of years of history. So reclaiming their identity is actually a gift, if you will. And if I had a silver lining that I could sort of, in this very terrible time, draw, it would be the silver lining of reminding us precisely who we are, that in many ways, perhaps many of us took for granted. And freedom is not free. And here we are once again being able to equip this next generation, not only with a memory of who they are, but with a reclamation of identity that is so central. And finally, not only do we have to remember and reclaim, but in many ways, this is a critical moment. And as we head into the high holidays, of course, actually, I think tonight we begin reciting Slichot in Israel, or some begin reciting Slichot in Israel. That's right, begin reciting Slichot after Rosh Chodesh. The understanding that we are not just in the month of Elul, but we're headed into the high holidays again. The renewal of the covenant, and depending on what audience I'm speaking to this audience, I will say the renewal of our covenant, the understanding of precisely what Simchat Torah that was desecrated symbolizes, the renewal of a covenant, of our covenant as a people to one another, and the renewal of our covenant to the book that kept us as a people for thousands of years and was desecrated on 10/7, is the opportunity not just for us internally, but the renewal of a covenant when it intersects with what ails the societies in which we live in the United States, in Canada, in Europe. I cannot tell you where I have traveled in the last year in which Jewish communities are not in this terrible sense of isolation and fear and estrangement from spaces and places, especially those that thought they belonged in progressive spaces and places, of aloneness. But the renewal of covenant also enables us in many ways to transcend and reach across real or perceived differences of geography, of denomination, of religion, of politics, in order to be able to identify the shared values of that covenant, not just amongst ourselves, but with all those, if I go back to what 10/7 represented, with all those who cherish our civilization, who cherish our humanity that it was attacked on 10/7 as it was on 9/11. The foundational principles, I speak to them very often as a lawyer of international law and human rights, those foundations that were created post World War II so that never again, including the institutions that were mandated to uphold, promote, and protect them equally and consistently, and they have failed, including universities that were mandated and trusted to teach how to think critically so that we can uphold them equally and consistently. And they have failed. And including, I'll say, in our times, I think another sort of front in which this is really challenging us is the fact that this is happening in a digital reality and in a virtual reality. That is another front in which renewing the covenant to what it is that binds us together as human beings, this becomes the opportunity to not only speak with your congregations, but to encourage them to stand up and to speak out, to remember their story, to reclaim their identity, and in many ways to renew the covenant that empowers them to be the boots on the ground that we need every single Jew around the world to be right now. There are no extras. Tonight I'm speaking at an event in the memory of the late Rabbi Sachs and for the launch and republication of his book, A Letter in the Scroll. The notion that each of us is a letter in the scroll, each one of us has not only the agency and the responsibility, but the capability of being that letter, of fulfilling that incredible link in the chain that he refers to. And there has never been a time in my lifetime where we didn't need each one of us to be those boots on the ground. I'm often reminded as I think back to 10/7, which again feels like 10 years ago, but a day ago, that 140% of the Israelis that were called up to duty, 140% showed up, 140%. And I take that with me as a reminder that if 140% of us show up 140% of the time, we've got this. Because one final piece to remember, I think, is that 2024 is not 1944. In 2024, we have a nation state to which we returned after millennia of exile and persecution. In 2024, we have sovereignty and an Israel Defense Force. In 2024, about half of us live in that nation state to which we returned, and the other half of us live in the rest of the world, primarily right here. And the understanding that it is our generation that can, I hope, maybe realize Rabbi Soloveitchik's transition from the covenant of fate, and I spoke about anti-Semitism, to the covenant of destiny, which requires that we opt in to the role that we have as boots on the ground. I think that we are the first generation that can actually realize that. And in that sense, it is not just a call to action, but is a call to great hope, requiring action and courage, that I think that in many ways you have the responsibility to bring forward to whoever it is that I'm sure will be participating and longing and looking for guidance, for answers at a time of so many questions, and for hope at a time of growing despair and distrust. And so thank you for doing what you do. And I'm really grateful that I had a chance to speak to you. And if we have a little bit of time, I have about 10 minutes. If you have time, then I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you. Oh, so give us your...
I have one question that's new because I read it this morning. I read that the United States has declared sin wants them as their enemies. Is that thoughts and prayers? I mean, what does that actually mean? Should I be hopeful or is that just words?
I want to say, look, we're embroiled in a multi-front, going to say unconventional war that has been raging for decades, right? Among the other things that this unconventional war successfully did, we sort of missed it, is that it co-opted and weaponized the law in many, including its institutions, right? The ICC, the ICJ, when you really think it through and you understand that if in 1975 Zionism is racism passed in the UN, and then in 2001, after the Durban Conference Against Racism, Israel was accused of being an apartheid state. And in 2023, I think probably the most Orwellian inversion of fact and of law, accusing Israel of genocide, even as it defends itself from not just intent, but actual attempt to genocide on 10/7 in the International Court of Justice, filed by none other than South Africa, using none other than the Convention for the Prevention and the Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. And just to remind you, the term genocide was coined by Raphael Lemkin, whose entire family was annihilated in Auschwitz, alongside crimes against humanity, actually coined by Lauterpacht. And he spent the remainder of his life creating the Convention for the Punishment and the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. That is the convention that South Africa used to allege that Israel was committing genocide. And so what I'm trying to say, I guess in a very long-winded way, is that the law is definitely a part of this war. And in many ways, we're going to have to show up to all of the battlefronts, including the legal battlefront. I think it's more than declaratory, because if you think of the Nuremberg trials, and that's the magnitude of what happened on 10/7, then this will, in many ways, hopefully lead the way with this sort of ironic situation in which the United States has the legal mechanisms to do that. Israel doesn't yet have them. It's a very, very interesting and maybe even, for me, illustrative anecdote of what I'm trying to say. When I look to North American Jews today, in the United States and in Canada as well, I look to you to say, you have a role as boots on the ground that fighting on this battlefront that Israel might not. That means that if all of us are boots on the ground, then maybe that war is going to be confronted from here. And I think that that can be actually very significant, as I said, not just as a statement, but as almost the history of how this will go down in the books, with the preparation of the legal mechanisms that not only have been appropriated, but can be used by us. I'll say one last thing about that. My hope and my goal that I hope I'll be able to advance in some way is that we're not just reactive, but proactive. So we continue reacting to what it is that our enemies define for us. If I had to say one thing that the transition from the covenant of fate to the covenant of destiny, if you will enable us, it is to create a comprehensive strategy as a people that is proactive and not just playing whack-a-mole with what we see on the multiple fronts, that we see them, the legal one being one of them. Yeah, yes.
When you mentioned about the genocide charge, I was thinking it really reminds me of the old adage we used to say as kids, and that is, I'm rubber and you're glue. Whatever you say about me bounces off of me and sticks to you. So whatever we're saying about Hamas is just bouncing off of them and being stuck to Israel. The question I want to ask you is, in light of just how shocking it was, the reaction, like you said, there was a day or two, and we kind of knew that sympathy would dissipate, but the amount and the intensity and how widespread this anti-Semitism. Do you have any theories as to how and why it is as it is?
Yeah. Thank you for asking that. And actually, your observation and your question are actually, for me, inextricably linked, because it's precisely how anti-Semitism works. When you understand that this millennia-old hatred mutates over time, right? And you understand that it does so by latching onto the guiding social construct of the time: religion, science, the secular religion of our times, human rights. And then you sort of zoom out and watch the systematic process in which human rights, I mentioned sort of in passing, have been systematically co-opted and weaponized in the international institutions, in the academic spaces, by the organizations that were created and entrusted to uphold, promote, and protect post-World War II, this international rules-based order, so that never again, right? What the notion that this was sort of something surprising. Not only was it not surprising for me, but when I got on that first plane, which was probably one of the hardest things I ever did, I just wanted to turn the plane around the entire way. When I got on the first plane, the tsunami of anti-Semitism that we have seen could have been predicted. I mean, this is a much bigger conversation that I do think we have to have as a people, because it actually speaks to what we need to do to be proactive. But the tsunami of anti-Semitism wasn't invented on 10/7. It didn't happen just as a response to 10/7. It intersects with processes that have happened, including in democracies, or primarily in democracies, actually, with what we call the Red-Green Alliance, right? Radical Islam and radical communist left ideologies that intersect on the streets of New York City. I mean, what I'm saying is actually, it sounds insane, except that when you think about Zionism as racism, 1975 passing in the UN, Soviet propaganda being alive and well on 2024 Columbia and other campuses, then you realize it's not so crazy at all. It's the way anti-Semitism has always worked. What was, I think, maybe surprising was not just the speed with which it happened, right? And this, I always refer to Golda Meir, who said, and this I think is also a wake-up call for us as a people, who said, you know, the world hates a Jew who hits back. The world loves us when we're to be pitied. Except that maybe what we didn't realize after thousands of years of exile and persecution is Israel is the Jew that can hit back, right? That's what we created. That was our shared project. That's what we realized pre-Holocaust, that there is only one ability that we will have of being a member state equal among the nations, which Israel was supposed to be, except that, in fact, demonized, delegitimized, and applied double standards to systematically, I'll remind you, the UN every single year accuses the state of Israel of more human rights violations than all the other countries in the world, right? I mean, that's just, you know, a fun fact, right? China, Iran, Russia, Venezuela, North Korea, all of them together, allegedly, according to the UN, have less human rights violations than the state of Israel. So it didn't, or as Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General, told us post 10/7, it didn't happen in a vacuum. It didn't happen in a vacuum because anti-Semitism has reached a level where we, in many ways, accepted its normalization. It was just anti-Zionist, right? Except that Zionist codes do. It's what's so important in what you have chosen as your umbrella, right? The Zionist Rabbinic Coalition says, no. Not only are we not accepting that Zionism is racism, we're wearing proudly our identity. But when you look back to understand what happened in the international institutions, and as it intersects with what we know has happened in processes of, I'm going to say, DEI, okay? DEI as a mechanism, and actually as a lawyer, I'll share with you that actually what I think about very often is, how did we get from equality to equity? Because they don't mean the same thing. And we sort of blinked and it happened overnight, but they do not mean the same thing. That is one of the opportunities for me, from my perspective, for us to reach, transcend and reach across real or perceived differences, right? Equity is neo-Marxism. Martin Luther King's dream for his 4 daughters, that they'd be judged by the content of their character and not the color of their skin, that is actually impacting the American understanding or the American dream, if you will. And something that I realized actually in our understanding of social justice, last week's Parsha, I don't know why it hit me, but for the first time, but you know, we often translate tzedakah as charity, which it isn't. Charity is not optional. Excuse me, tzedakah is not optional, right? A very poor person also has to give tzedakah. Charity is optional. You give it, you cannot give it. It makes you feel good if you give it. That is not our understanding of social justice. Probably the closest term to tzedakah is social justice, except in our understanding of social justice, there is no oppressed victim. In our understanding of social justice, we have agency. We have responsibility. The poorest person is mandated, has to give tzedakah. And that is something in which, if I had to say, where we can light the way forward in a very confused world that has really gone off track in this disempowering understanding that if you are on the oppressed victim side, that is who you are forever. You are an oppressed victim. That is the most disempowering concept I've ever encountered. And in that sense, if I had to sort of, again, silver lining, I guess that's what I look for. It is a real moment of opportunity to reach across difference, because there are many people that are feeling something is very wrong here. Meaning, if you could steal from Lululemon up to $500 and get away with it, I don't know, there's something going on that doesn't make sense. And the security guard won't stop you, literally. Security guard won't stop you. That is a moment in which we look at our society and say, all right, something has gone really astray. Is there a conversation we need to be having, not to do with Jews, not to do with anti-Semitism, to do with the foundational principles of our countries, of our spaces? It's a little bit of what I alluded to in the notion of renewing the covenant, including renewing the covenant to the societies or the institutions that we're a part of. So I hope that answers. Yes. Yes. Yes.
Really a lot of respect. Okay.
Everything.
So I don't think a lot of us were shocked when the blame was put on Netanyahu by governments or people here, whatever. But how can you help us talk about hundreds of thousands of Israelis holding signs saying not blaming Hamas?
Yeah. Look, the first thing that I'll say, I actually had a couple of interviews I've been here just for a day, I guess. It's not in the last few days. Yesterday, a few interviews, and that's all they wanted to know about, right? I couldn't even talk about the demonstrations here. All they wanted to know about was there are hundreds of thousands of Israelis blaming Netanyahu. Look, and maybe here I'll speak a little bit also as a former member of Knesset, but from my role as Israel's special envoy. And it's critical for me to make clear, anti-Semitism thrives when we politicize it. So the reason that it does is because the mechanism, demonizing, delegitimizing, and applying double standards, is a very dangerous mechanism, okay? Now, a lot of the people in the streets are grieving, in pain, overwhelmed with this sense of helplessness, because for 11 months, there is an ongoing war. That's a lot of the people in the streets. Some of the people in the streets are people who just hate Netanyahu, okay? And they've been there for years, the people who just hate Netanyahu. What I often say is Israel's a democracy, like every other democracy. And at the moment, all of our democracies are facing really serious challenges. You have a couple of your own right here in the United States of America. Serious. Democracy is under real attack and has its own internal challenges, including in a virtual reality. And Israel's not different. It's not perfect. We hold it up to a pedestal and say, but surely Israel too, as a democracy, faces challenges. What I wish, this I haven't said in my interviews, but I will say it to you, and I think you can share it with your congregation. What I wish is that the same crews would actually attend every funeral that I have attended, where hundreds of thousands walk and stand in silence. They are speechless. Some of them are the same people that go on Saturday night. Some of them are totally different people that do not go out on Saturday nights. But the understanding that there are many ways to be grieving at this moment, and nobody shows, including the funeral that I came from. I was at Almog's funeral on whenever the day was before I got on a plane to come here. And of course, the next day was Hirsch's funeral, and my kids were there. All of the entire country came to Jerusalem and lined the streets with flags. And so, zooming in on one sort of, very troubling manifestation of what we see is almost natural. It's also loud, it's also boisterous, and it intends to be. Understanding that it is a part of what challenges democracies, and certainly Israeli democracy, deeply at the moment, but it is a democracy, and so we will have elections, and if what needs to happen is that there will be a change in government, then so be it. But I would always, always insist, because I'm a single standard girl, that we apply the same standard to Israel as we do to every other country and democracy that's under serious challenge or duress. And in many ways, I think that that has been lost in the sort of conversation that we're having. And I'll say one last thing maybe about those 3Ds, because I'm a single standard girl. You know, there is a prime minister who was elected democratically, and he's the sitting prime minister of a country in which democracy guides our way forward. To shift the blame, and it's almost natural that we want somebody to blame, and Hamas doesn't care that we blame them, but to shift the blame away from the international community. And I'm going to say this very openly. On 10/8, the United States of America could have said to Qatar, you see this list of terror supporting states? You're going to be number one because you house Hamas terrorists. But instead, Qatar got cast as an honest broker. Look at that. So there are many elements of this very nuanced and challenging moment that we have to be able to interpret, certainly you, for your communities, for those that are looking for some insights, but be sure that we understand there is one entity to be held to account, not just for 10/7, but for the war, multi-front war raging since 10/7. By the way, it's not Hamas, it's Iran. There is this lack of understanding that we are, I'm probably going to guess, I wasn't alive, pre-World War II, that there were people who were running to the United States. I sort of felt like that on my first trip to say, you don't understand what's happening. The dark clouds, they're looming. And there is this, axis of evil that's forming. There is an axis of evil that's forming. I'm not sure I'm not breaking this to you, right? Iran, Russia, China, North Korea. You just have to look at what it is that's happening. And it's very easy to find the Jew, whether it's the individual Jew or the Jewish nation state, and say, it's the Jew. We caution us not to get not just embroiled, but enable that blaming of whether it's an individual Jew or the Jewish nation state, and that we continue having the moral clarity to demand accountability, especially the 6 million boots on the ground, that can actually continue to shift the conversation back to where it should be. What are we doing about Qatar? What are we doing about Egypt? What are we doing about Turkey, a member of NATO? What are we doing? And it's not politics. It's actually transcends politics in that sense. Very often in our world, it becomes politics. And I think that you have a very important role to be able to, you don't have political roles, thank God, to be able to lead congregations through and navigate them through these very difficult times. I think it was last Shabbat, the late Rabbi Sachs spoke about the role of a leader, and I hadn't thought of it that way before. And it doesn't matter what kind of leader, a parent, a spiritual leader, a political leader, the understanding that the role of a leader is to actually interpret what it is that we see, right? Things are not just as they appear to be. They're much more complicated than that. And I guess that that's a part of this nuanced conversation that's much harder to have in our polarized, fragmentized social media, algorithmically, whatever reality. But it's where your roles are so critically important as leaders. So thanks.